The hotel's gilded cage, the Empire Grand Hotel's conference suite, glimmered like a temple built for kings. Crystal chandeliers rained light down on polished mahogany tables. Golden trim lined the walls where portraits of forgotten tycoons hung, their painted gazes cool and knowing. The air hummed with a tension that clung like perfume, the smell of money in motion. Servers moved quietly like shadows, carrying trays of imported water, champagne, and platters of hors d'oeuvres arranged like art pieces. Among them was Maya Williams, her crisp black and white uniform fitted with an apron that had been ironed at dawn. Her curls were pinned neatly away from her face, though a single rebellious strand brushed her temple. She balanced a tray of crystal glasses on her hand, her steps light, her head lowered. To the gathered billionaires, CFOs, and delegates, she was invisible. That was the point. Service staff were meant to blend into the background of the empire machine, functioning like gears, unnoticed but essential. Yet Maya's eyes were not those of a shadow. Behind her composed expression burned a restless intellect. She scanned the grand room with quiet precision, every movement catalogued. Years ago, she would have been seated on the other side of this table, notebook open, solving chemical equations and sketching molecular structures. Back then, she'd been Maya Williams, UCLA's rising star in biochemical engineering, a girl with more scholarship offers than she could count. But life had a way of rewriting destinies. Now she was Maya the waitress, working double shifts to pay for her mother's mounting medical bills, trading textbooks for aprons, lectures for late-night shifts, labs for linen napkins. Still, numbers never faded. The billionaire and the formula at the head of the table sat Ethan Maddox. He was the kind of man who carried entire empires in his shadow. Tall, broad-shouldered, his suit tailored with surgical precision, Ethan looked more like a sculpted statue than a living man. His steel blue eyes skimmed over the glowing screen behind him, where a molecular scaffold gleamed in digital brilliance. The deal before him was monumental, a $100 million investment in a biochemical formula touted as revolutionary. If signed, Maddox Biotech would hold the patent rights that promised to reshape the future of regenerative medicine. Every delegate present understood the stakes. Whispers of projected profits in the billions rippled through the room. The European delegate, Alrek, leaned toward the American CFO, murmuring with a smirk, "Once the scaffold collapses, we dump our equity. Maddox takes the fall. We walk clean." Maya nearly dropped her tray. The words struck like shards of glass against her chest. She had only caught fragments, but her gaze instinctively lifted to the formula on the screen. Her breath caught. The hydrophilic charge groups were reversed. A fatal flaw. One she had studied years ago. By the third cycle, the entire compound would neutralize itself, imploding the research and Ethan's reputation. Her pulse thundered. This wasn't oversight. This was sabotage. The choice Maya set the tray down near the end of the table, her hands trembling. Her mind raced, caught between two paths. She could stay silent, fade back into the safety of anonymity, collect her paycheck, and go home to her mother. Or she could speak. Speaking meant risk. Speaking meant stepping outside her place, outside the invisible cage society had built for her. Her eyes darted to Ethan's pen, poised over the contract. If he signed, the deal would seal his downfall. Something inside her, that old fire, the part of her that once believed she could change the world, refused to let it happen. Maya moved forward, heart hammering. She leaned in just behind the billionaire, her voice a whisper but sharp as a blade. "Sir, if you sign that formula, it won't just fail. It'll collapse, and take your reputation with it." The words fell into the silence like a stone cast into still water. Collision of worlds. Ethan turned slowly. His steel blue eyes slid over her uniform, her name tag, her skin, detached, dismissive, the look of a man who had never been questioned by someone beneath his station. "Excuse me?" His voice was smooth, edged with amused disbelief. Maya's throat tightened, but her voice did not falter. "The hydrophilic charge groups are reversed. By the third cycle, it will neutralize itself. And your partners, they know. I overheard them planning to blame the lab." A low chuckle came from the CFO. "God, this is rich. A waitress with conspiracy theories." Laughter snaked around the table. Ethan raised a brow, lips curving faintly in condescension. "Do you have any idea how complex this research is? Or how absurd you sound? Kindly step back," he added, turning toward the screen. And let us finish our business. Heat flooded Maya's cheeks. He wasn't listening. He was dismissing her. Pride over truth. Her gaze fell on the pen again, trembling between his fingers. If he signed, it was over. She couldn't let it happen. "The pen, sir, please," she began again. "Enough," Ethan snapped. His voice cracked like a whip. "Security." Before the guards could move, Maya stepped forward. Her hand shot out, snatching the pen from his fingers. The room gasped. Chairs scraped. A ripple of outrage swept the table. Maya's hand trembled, clutching the pen, but her voice carried louder now, breaking through the storm. "You don't understand. They're setting you up. That formula will implode. You will lose everything." Ethan's jaw clenched, eyes flashing with fury. "Give me back my pen." "Not until you look," Maya shot back, her voice shaking but resolute. "Not until you check the sequence yourself." Silence fell like a curtain. Even the CFO's smirk faltered. For the first time that evening, Ethan Maddox truly looked at her. Not at her uniform, not at her skin, but into her eyes. And what he saw was not guile, not arrogance, but urgency and conviction. The revelation slowly, Ethan took the pen from her trembling hand. His fingers brushed hers, steady and cold. He turned to the screen, stylus in hand, and began marking corrections over the molecular model she had described. One change, another. The error revealed itself at once. A fatal flaw. Ethan froze, exhaled. The silence in the room deepened into awe. "She's right," he said quietly. Gasps rippled through the room. The CFO stammered, This is a misunderstanding." "Enough," Ethan cut him off, eyes still locked on the formula. Meeting adjourned. "No one leaves with any documents until I review every line." Security moved toward the doors. Ethan turned fully now, his voice low, edged with something new. "Respect." "Who are you?" Maya swallowed hard. "Maya Williams. Hospitality staff. Biochemical engineering. UCLA. Dropped out when my mother got sick." Ethan studied her for a long-waited moment. Then a slow, rueful smile ghosted across his baying, the expression of a man who realized how close he had come to ruin. "You just saved me from a $100 million disaster." The unfolding future. Maya's hands shook as she handed the pen back. I couldn't stay quiet." "You won't be forgotten," Ethan murmured. The delegates exchanged uneasy glances, the saboteurs pale and silent. Maya stepped back, pulse still racing. She didn't know what came next. Maybe she'd be fired. Maybe worse. But she knew one thing. The whisper had changed everything. It was the first crack in the wall between who she was and who she was meant to be. From shadows to spotlight, the conference room that only minutes earlier had brimmed with certainty and arrogance now hung in a silence so thick it almost buzzed. The glowing formulas on the screen had gone from a promise of profit to a revelation of betrayal. Papers lay abandoned, glasses half full, and the men and women who considered themselves titans of industry now sat staring uneasily at the young woman in the plain server's uniform who had just defied them all. Maya's chest rose and fell with shallow, rapid breaths, but her chin was held high even as her heart pounded against her ribs. She had not planned this, had never imagined herself standing in a place where her voice alone had disrupted millions of dollars in motion. And yet, here she was, no longer a shadow in the room but the focal point of every eye. Ethan Maddox, whose empire stretched across continents and whose wealth made presidents court his approval, leaned back in his chair and regarded her with something between disbelief and fascination. His life had been a sequence of deals, acquisitions, and victories, each one achieved through control and calculation. He was not a man easily surprised, and yet this young waitress, this stranger who had no place in his boardroom, had just upended everything. For a moment he said nothing, only drumming his fingers slowly against the polished table as if he were recalibrating the entire room in his mind. Finally, his voice, low and resonant, cut through the tension. "Everyone out, now!" The command carried the weight of absolute authority. Chairs scraped reluctantly, papers shuffled, and in less than a minute the suite that had been filled with the hum of power was nearly empty. Only Ethan, Maya, and 2 security guards remained. The silence stretched as Ethan rose, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the table. He crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps until he stood only a few feet from her. Maya resisted the urge to retreat, though every instinct screamed at her to shrink back into the safety of obscurity. His eyes, sharp and glacial, searched her face as though he were parsing not just her words but the truth of who she was. Biochemical engineering at UCLA, he repeated, his tone not mocking now but thoughtful, almost testing the sound of the words. Dropped out when your mother got sick. He spoke as though trying to align this fragment of her life with the undeniable intelligence she had just demonstrated. You recognized a flaw my entire research division overlooked or ignored. Tell me, Maya Williams, how does a hotel waitress see what men with doctorates and years of experience missed? The question hung between them like a challenge. Maya's throat tightened, but her voice emerged steady. Because I loved it. I didn't study formulas just to pass exams or impress professors. I lived inside them. I saw patterns where others saw numbers. And when you live with something that deeply, it doesn't leave you, not even when life pulls you away. Her voice softened as she added, numbers don't fade, they stick. Her eyes dropped briefly, the weight of her reality pressing against the fragile defiance she had summoned. I didn't choose to leave that world. It was ripped from me. My mother needed me. Her hospital bills didn't wait for graduation. For the first time, something flickered in Ethan's expression. A shadow of recognition, perhaps even sympathy, though it was quickly masked. He had grown his empire with no one to fall back on but his own unyielding will. Yet he knew what it meant to sacrifice pieces of oneself for the sake of survival. He had buried that knowledge beneath layers of control, but hearing it in her voice cracked something open. He folded his arms, his gaze still fixed on her. Do you understand the risk you took? Interrupting me in front of my board? Accusing my partners of sabotage? If you had been wrong. His words trailed off, heavy with unspoken consequences. Maya met his stare, her spine straightening. If I had been wrong, I would have been fired. Maybe worse. But you would have signed your name to a failure that would define you forever. I couldn't let that happen. Not if I saw the truth. Her words came out more forcefully than she expected, and for a brief second she saw Ethan's lips twitch. Not in anger, but as though he were suppressing a smile. The two security guards shifted uneasily at the edges of the room, uncertain whether their presence was still required. Ethan dismissed them with a flick of his hand, leaving only the billionaire and the waitress standing face to face in the cavernous silence of the gilded suite. The absurdity of it might have made Maya laugh if the weight of what had just happened weren't pressing down on her like stone. Ethan moved to the window, pulling back the heavy drapes to reveal the city skyline glittering against the night. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, and for a long moment he said nothing. When he finally turned, his voice was quieter, more measured. You've put yourself in the spotlight, Maya, whether you wanted it or not. And now the question is, what do you want to do with it? The words struck her like a bolt of electricity. What did she want? For years she had buried her ambitions beneath duty and exhaustion, trading dreams of laboratories and breakthroughs for late shifts and bills that never seemed to shrink. She wanted freedom. She wanted her mother healthy. She wanted the life she had once glimpsed, the life she thought had been stolen forever. And yet here was a man whose power could shift her entire trajectory, asking her directly what she wanted. Her lips parted, but the words tangled on her tongue. I don't know, she admitted finally, the honesty cutting sharper than any pretense could have. Ethan's gaze lingered on her, and something in his expression shifted. This was not the bravado of an opportunist or the arrogance of someone grasping beyond their reach. It was the raw, unvarnished uncertainty of a person who had been beaten down but not broken. And in that vulnerability, Ethan saw a reflection of something he respected. He crossed the room once more, this time slower, his eyes never leaving hers. Then perhaps, he said, his voice steady, you should help me find out who tried to end my company tonight. Because if they are willing to risk $100 million to sabotage me, they won't stop here. And I have a feeling, his lips curved faintly, that you may see what others don't. Maya blinked, stunned. The idea of stepping into his world, of being anything other than invisible, terrified her. But beneath the fear stirred something else, an ember of the fire she thought had died. The girl who once believed she could solve problems that mattered, who dreamed of discoveries that would change lives, stirred awake inside her. She did not answer immediately, but her silence was not refusal. It was the pause of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, realizing they had the chance to leap. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of both hesitation and resolve. If I do this, if I help you, what happens when they find out I'm not supposed to be here? That I'm just a waitress? The word felt bitter on her tongue. Ethan's eyes hardened, his tone firm. Then they'll underestimate you, which, as you've just proven, may be your greatest advantage. He extended his hand, palm open. So, Maya Williams, are you willing to step out of the shadows? Her heart hammered as she stared at his hand, at the invitation it represented. She thought of her mother, of the endless bills stacked like weights on their kitchen table. She thought of the life she had once dreamed of the way numbers and formulas had once made her feel alive. Slowly, with a breath that seemed to stretch across years of struggle, she placed her hand in his. In that moment, the trajectory of her life shifted forever. Enemies in the boardroom. The morning after the storm that had unfolded inside the Empire Grand Hotel's conference suite, the city seemed strangely unchanged, as though the clash between truth and deception had not sent ripples far beyond those gilded walls. Cars still crawled along the avenues, coffee shops hummed with tired chatter, and newspapers fluttered in the hands of commuters who had no idea that $100 million collapse had been avoided only because a waitress had spoken when silence was safer. For Maya, the ordinary rhythm of the city felt almost surreal. She stood at the bus stop with her hair pulled back in a loose bun, her apron folded neatly in her bag, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but her mind still electrified. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ethan's steel-blue stare, the gleam of the sabotaged formula and the smirk on the CFO's face before it faltered. It all replayed like a fever dream, and she questioned whether it had even happened. Yet when her phone buzzed with a message from the hotel's front desk manager, instructing her to report directly to Mr. Maddox's office that morning instead of her usual service shift, she knew it had been no dream. Ethan Maddox's office was nothing like the conference suite where their paths had crossed. It was higher, quieter, and more austere, perched atop one of the tallest towers in the city, with floor-to-ceiling windows that stretched out over the horizon. The space was immaculate, designed not to impress but to focus. Dark walnut shelves lined with neatly ordered volumes, a long desk of black glass, and in the corner, a single sculpture of interlocking steel pieces that seemed to defy gravity. When Maya was ushered inside, she felt the weight of the room pressing against her, as though she had entered the inner sanctum of power itself. Ethan rose from behind the desk, his posture as precise as the lines of his suit, and gestured for her to sit opposite him. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "You were right," he said simply, sliding a tablet across the desk toward her. "I had my independent team review the formula last night. They confirmed your observation. The error was deliberate. Not negligence, sabotage." His voice, calm and deliberate, carried none of the arrogance of the night before. If anything, it carried a steely resolve. That means someone inside my circle was willing to destroy me for their own gain. And that means I cannot trust them. But you? He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as if to gauge her reaction. You saw what they wanted me to miss, which makes you dangerous to them. The words sank heavily into Maya's chest. She had not thought of herself as dangerous. She had only thought of herself as desperate to tell the truth. But now she was beginning to understand the stakes. These were not harmless errors or office politics. These were billion-dollar decisions laced with betrayal, where men like Ulrich and the CFO could topple reputations without blinking. She remembered the cold laughter in the boardroom, the casual way they had plotted to leave Ethan holding the blame, and she shivered. She could disappear back into her job, into the safe anonymity of serving glasses and folding napkins. But if she did, she would carry the weight of knowing she had walked away from something larger than herself. Ethan seemed to sense the war inside her, and his tone softened. You don't have to be here, Maya. You could walk away now and no one would fault you. But if you stay, if you help me uncover who orchestrated this, you need to understand something. They will not sit quietly. They will fight back, and the higher we climb, the stronger the winds get. For a long moment, Maya was silent, staring down at the tablet where the formula glowed, the lines of chemical bonds dancing like old friends she had abandoned. She thought of her mother's tired smile, the mounting medical bills, the exhaustion that had become her daily companion. But she also thought of the thrill she had felt when Ethan confirmed she was right, the spark of life that had ignited in her when numbers and truth aligned. She lifted her chin, her voice steady. I've lived in the shadows long enough. If someone is willing to gamble lives and reputations for greed, then I won't be silent. I'll help. A faint smile touched Ethan's lips, though it was more grim acknowledgement than triumph. Then you should understand what that means. We are not just fighting for numbers on a screen. We are fighting for the soul of this company, for every scientist who worked in good faith, for every patient who may one day rely on these formulas. If we fail, the cost will not just be mine, it will be everyone's. From that moment, the trajectory of their alliance was set. Ethan began including Maya in private reviews of company documents, late-night sessions where they pored over research notes and financial ledgers, searching for the fingerprints of sabotage. At first, she felt out of place, perched in a leather chair too large for her frame, surrounded by data analysts and legal advisors who looked at her with thinly veiled skepticism. She was still wearing second-hand shoes and carrying the weariness of double shifts in her posture, while they wore suits worth more than her monthly rent. But as she spoke, as she pointed out subtle inconsistencies in the research data, overlooked anomalies in the financial reports, the room began to shift. The analysts stopped dismissing her. They started listening. Ethan's gaze would flick toward her, a silent signal that her insights carried weight, and slowly, Maya felt the shadows recede. Yet the more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the sabotage ran deeper than they had imagined. The formula had been tampered with at multiple stages, each error subtle enough to evade casual scrutiny, but devastating if left unchecked. The financial projections had been manipulated to conceal the flaws until after the deal was signed. Even the timelines of lab reports had been altered. This was not the work of a careless intern or a disgruntled employee. This was orchestrated from the top, by someone with access and authority, someone close to Ethan. The realization gnawed at him. For years, he had prided himself on building a fortress of loyalty, surrounding himself with the best minds and sharpest strategists. To admit that betrayal had taken root inside his circle was to admit he had failed to see what mattered most. Alone in his office late at night, Ethan would stand at the window, his reflection merging with the city lights, and think of the waitress who had seen what he had not. Her courage unsettled him. Her clarity cut through the fog of arrogance that had blinded him. And though he would not say it aloud, he knew that without her whisper he might have signed his empire into ruin. But Maya's presence did not go unnoticed. Whispers began circulating through the company corridors, about the waitress who now sat in closed-door meetings, the outsider who dared to question data that had been rubber-stamped by executives. Some dismissed her as Ethan's whim, others as a pawn in some larger play, but those who had conspired against him saw her for what she truly was, a threat. And threats in their world were meant to be eliminated. It began with subtle hostility, a cold glance from an executive as she passed in the hallway, a whispered comment about her uniform when she still covered shifts at the hotel to make ends meet. But soon it escalated. Her locker at the hotel was broken into. Anonymous messages began appearing on her phone, cryptic warnings to stay in her lane and remember her place. One night, walking home, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being followed. Fear gnawed at her edges, but beneath it burned a deeper resolve. She had been underestimated all her life, dismissed as invisible, as unworthy of a seat at the table. If they thought intimidation would send her scurrying back into the shadows, they had chosen the wrong woman. And yet fear has a way of creeping in during the quiet moments. Late at night, when her mother's breathing was the only sound in their tiny apartment, Maya would lie awake staring at the ceiling, questioning whether she had been reckless. What if she had endangered them both? What if she had stepped into a battle too large, too ruthless for someone like her? But every time doubt threatened to smother her, she remembered Ethan's words. They'll underestimate you, which may be your greatest advantage. The boardroom became a battlefield where alliances shifted like sand. Ethan, once untouchable, now found himself questioned by the very people who had cheered his decisions. Some pushed back against delays in signing the deal, insisting the flaws were minor and could be corrected later. Others subtly cast doubt on Maya's credibility, painting her as a distraction, an inexperienced outsider. Yet every time the pressure mounted, Maya's clear-eyed observations cut through their arguments like a blade. She spoke not with arrogance, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew what she was seeing, someone who could not be bought or silenced. And slowly Ethan began to realize that her presence was not just useful, it was essential. But as the enemies in the boardroom grew bolder, one truth became undeniable. The battle ahead would demand more than whispered warnings and sharp insights. It would demand resilience, courage, and sacrifice. For Maya, stepping into the spotlight was no longer a choice. It was survival. And for Ethan Maddox, the man who had once dismissed her as invisible, it was becoming clear that the future of his empire might rest not on the loyalty of his executives or the brilliance of his scientists, but on the courage of the woman who had dared to whisper the truth. The cost of truth, the storm that had begun as a whisper in a boardroom, was now gathering momentum, invisible yet undeniable. The more Maya delved into the undercurrents of Maddox Biotech's inner workings, the more she realized that she had stepped into a labyrinth designed to break people who asked the wrong questions. What began as quiet suspicion had evolved into a campaign of pressure and intimidation. Ethan's rivals, those who had engineered the sabotage, were no longer content to let her sit quietly at his side. They wanted her silenced, and they had every tool of power, wealth, and influence at their disposal to achieve that goal. The first sign that the stakes had shifted came not in the office but at home. Maya returned one evening to their cramped apartment after another long day at Ethan's headquarters, her bag heavy with papers and lab reports. Her mother was sitting in the armchair by the window, the evening light falling softly across her tired face. She looked smaller than Maya remembered, her shoulders hunched, her skin pale. The illness had been wearing her down for years, and every day was a negotiation between pain and endurance. Yet what worried Maya most was not her mother's health, but the unease in her eyes. "Maya," she said quietly, holding up an envelope that had been slipped under the door. "This came for you." Inside, scrawled in sharp black ink on heavy paper, were 6 words that chilled her blood. "You don't belong in his world." There was no signature, no mark, nothing but the message and the unmistakable intent behind it. Maya folded the paper slowly, forcing her expression into calm reassurance for her mother's sake. "It's nothing," she lied. "Probably just some prank." But as she lay awake that night, the note sat on her bedside table like a silent threat. She knew better. Pranks didn't follow you home. Pranks didn't know your name. At Maddox Biotech, the atmosphere was no less fraught. Ethan's once loyal circle had begun to fracture under the weight of suspicion. Meetings grew tense, with every executive aware that the sabotage had been exposed, but none daring to admit culpability. Yet instead of rallying around Ethan, several began to question his judgment. Whispers that he was losing his edge or too distracted circulated through the corridors, fueled in part by his visible reliance on Maya's insights. What infuriated them most was not her brilliance, it was her presence. A waitress-turned-advisor was an affront to their carefully constructed hierarchies. If Ethan listened to her, what did that say about their years of experience and their own carefully guarded positions? The resistance reached a breaking point during one particularly heated board meeting. Ethan had gathered his top executives to confront inconsistencies in the research data. Maya sat quietly at his side, flipping through documents, her notes marked with the meticulous detail of someone who had lived and breathed molecular patterns. When she spoke, pointing out an anomaly in the timestamps of lab submissions, the room erupted. One executive slammed his hand on the table, his voice dripping with disdain. "This is absurd. Are we really entertaining the accusations of someone with no credentials, no standing in this company? She pours water for a living, for God's sake, and we're treating her as though she's a chief scientist?" Maya felt the heat of humiliation crawl up her neck, but before she could respond, Ethan's voice cut through the uproar like a blade. "She saved this company from a $100 million catastrophe that all of you failed to prevent. If that makes her more competent than the people I pay to keep me informed, then perhaps the problem is not her presence but your incompetence." His words were calm, but the steel in them was unmistakable. The room fell silent, though the glares directed at Maya carried a promise. She would be made to pay for her defiance of their order. That night, Ethan stayed behind in his office long after the others had gone. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as he stared at the city below. Maya lingered by the window, unsure whether to speak. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You should know what this means. By standing with me, you're painting a target on your back. These people, they don't forgive embarrassment. They'll come after you." His gaze, when it lifted to meet hers, was sharper than she had ever seen it. "And they'll come after me through you." Maya's voice trembled with honesty but not fear. "They already have. I found a note at my door last night." She handed him the folded slip of paper, Ethan's jaw tightened as he read it, his expression darkening. For a moment he looked like a man ready to wage war, and perhaps he was. But beneath the fury was something else, a flicker of guilt, as though he realized her involvement had dragged her into dangers she never asked for. He set the note down carefully, his voice low. Then they've made their first mistake. The days that followed only deepened the tension. Maya found herself looking over her shoulder more often, noticing unfamiliar faces lingering near her bus stop, her mother receiving calls where the line went dead as soon as she answered. Yet alongside the fear came something unexpected, strength. She began to understand that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And every time she sat beside Ethan in the boardroom, every time she exposed another lie hidden in the labyrinth of data, she felt that strength grow. But courage had its cost. Her mother, though proud of her, began to worry aloud that Maya was overextending herself. The stress was taking its toll, and more than once Maya arrived home to find her mother coughing, her energy depleted. Guilt gnawed at her. Was she abandoning her duty at home in pursuit of a fight that might consume them both? Was she risking everything for a man whose world was not hers? One night, unable to bear the weight of the questions, she sat by her mother's bed and whispered, "Maybe I should stop. Maybe I should just go back to work, keep my head down, and let him fight his own battles." Her mother's eyes, weary but fierce, locked onto hers. "Maya, I raised you to see the truth even when others can't. If you walk away from this now, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Don't let fear decide who you are. Don't let it steal your voice again." The words settled deep in her heart, a reminder that the path of least resistance was not the path she was meant to walk. Meanwhile, Ethan's own battles escalated. He discovered that someone inside his leadership team had leaked confidential information to competitors, undermining his negotiations with potential partners. Projects were delayed, investors grew restless, and whispers of replacing him began to surface. For the first time in years, Ethan Maddox felt the ground beneath his empire shift. Alone in his office, he admitted to himself what he had never confessed to anyone. He was afraid. Not of losing money. He had more than enough to survive a lifetime of setbacks. He was afraid of losing what defined him, of being reduced from a visionary leader to a cautionary tale of arrogance and downfall. And strangely, the only person who seemed to cut through the noise, the only one who reminded him of clarity, was the woman who had stepped out of the shadows with nothing but conviction. The cost of truth was mounting on both of them. For Maya, it was the safety of her home, the health of her mother, the thin line between courage and recklessness. For Ethan, it was the loyalty of his circle, the stability of his empire, the slow realization that power could not shield him from betrayal. And yet, even as the weight grew heavier, so too did the bond between them. It was forged not from romance or convenience, but from necessity, from the recognition that in a world of deception, they had found in each other something rare, an ally who saw what others chose to ignore. The battle lines were no longer blurred. They were drawn clearly in the sand. Maya and Ethan stood on one side, truth their weapon, while on the other stood men who measured loyalty in profit and morality in losses. And as the pressure mounted, one truth became clearer than all others. The fight ahead would not just test their intellect or their courage. It would test their very capacity to endure, because in a world built on power and profit, the cost of truth was never cheap. Rising from the ashes, the city had grown colder, though perhaps it was only the way Maya felt it pressing in on her. Autumn's early winds whispered through the streets, carrying with them the brittle edge of change, of endings and beginnings all at once. It had been weeks since she had whispered her warning into Ethan Maddox's ear. Weeks since her life had shifted from the dim anonymity of hotel hallways to the blinding spotlight of boardrooms and backroom battles. She was no longer invisible. Every step she took now carried weight, and every word she spoke reverberated in places she never dreamed her voice would reach. Yet with visibility came danger, and the shadows that had once sheltered her now seemed alive with threats waiting to strike. Ethan's empire was trembling. What began as a single sabotaged formula had widened into a war of attrition, every day bringing new evidence of betrayal. Competitors seemed to anticipate his moves before they were made. Investors hesitated where they once surged forward, and projects stalled under the weight of missing data or compromised labs. It was not chaos by accident. It was orchestrated. the work of rivals who knew precisely where to cut to make him bleed slowly. The enemies were clever enough to hide their tracks, powerful enough to buy silence, and ruthless enough to risk billions in the process. Yet what unsettled Ethan most was not the betrayal itself, but the growing realization that some of his oldest allies had chosen profit over loyalty. Maya stood at his side through it all, often feeling the burden of her position more acutely than he allowed himself to admit. She was not supposed to be here. Every time she stepped into the gleaming headquarters of Maddox Biotech, she felt the glares of executives who resented her intrusion, who whispered behind her back about the audacity of a waitress turned advisor. Yet no matter how sharp the looks, no matter how cutting the words, she pressed on. She could not undo the night she had spoken, nor could she silence the part of her that burned to see truth prevail.
Still, there were nights when she lay awake in her narrow bed,
listening to her mother's labored breathing in the next room, and wondered if she had overstepped into a world that would consume her. The breaking point came when Ethan announced that they would expose the sabotage publicly at the upcoming Global Investor Summit, an event that drew the most powerful financiers and innovators from around the world. It was a bold move, one that would either restore faith in his company or destroy it entirely if they failed to present irrefutable proof. "We cannot fight this battle in shadows," Ethan told her one late night in his office, the skyline burning behind him in 1,000 glittering lights. "If we are to survive, the world must see not just what they tried to do, but who they truly are." His tone was firm, resolute, but she saw the storm beneath it. He was betting everything, and in that gamble she could see both his brilliance and his desperation. The weeks leading up to the summit were grueling. Maya pored over stacks of documents, her eyes raw from sleepless nights searching for patterns, anomalies, hidden fingerprints of deceit. Ethan's analysts provided data. His lawyers crafted arguments. But it was often Maya who noticed the subtle inconsistencies they overlooked. The misplaced decimal, the duplicated timestamp, the statistical curve that did not align with reality. Slowly, a tapestry of evidence began to emerge, not only proving sabotage but implicating specific individuals. And with every discovery, Maya felt the noose tighten. The more she revealed, the clearer it became that someone was watching her closely, waiting for their moment to strike. That moment came sooner than she expected. 3 days before the summit, security burst into Ethan's office with urgent news. Sensitive research files had been stolen, and the system logs indicated that Maya's access card had been used. She froze as the words sank in, her heart pounding with disbelief. She had not touched those files, had never even been granted clearance to the most sensitive datasets. Yet the evidence was damning. Logs, security footage doctored to show her entering restricted labs at odd hours, even emails fabricated to suggest she had been in contact with competitors. The board erupted with fury. Executives who had resented her from the beginning now saw their chance to expel her. They accused her of being a plant, a spy sent to sabotage from within under the guise of a helpful outsider. Ethan defended her fiercely, but even his voice could not drown out the storm of accusation. The press caught wind of the scandal, headlines screaming about the waitress-turned-traitor who had infiltrated Maddox Biotech. Overnight, the woman who had been invisible was now infamous, her name dragged through every corner of the industry. Maya sat in a cold interrogation room as corporate security questioned her relentlessly, her hands shaking as she tried to explain the truth. "I didn't do this," she said again and again, her voice breaking under the weight of disbelief. "Someone planted this. You have to see that." But logic was powerless against carefully planted evidence, and soon she found herself escorted from the building in handcuffs. Cameras flashing outside as reporters shouted questions she had no strength to answer. Her world, which had only just begun to expand, seemed to collapse in a single night. Back in her apartment, her mother clutched her hand, whispering words of comfort even as fear shadowed her eyes. Maya wanted to break, to let the tears fall, but something inside her hardened instead. She had been underestimated her entire life, dismissed, silenced, forgotten. Now they had tried to frame her, to crush her under the weight of lies. And though the humiliation burned, though the fear gnawed at her, she felt something deeper stir, a refusal to be broken, a defiance that rose from the same place her whisper had been born. Meanwhile, Ethan raged. He knew the evidence was too neat, too perfectly damning to be anything but a trap. He could see the smirks on the faces of those who had doubted him, the satisfaction of rivals who believed they had finally weakened him beyond recovery. But what they failed to understand was that Ethan Maddox had not built his empire by yielding to pressure. Beneath his cold exterior was a furnace of relentless will, and now that will was directed not at profit but at vindication, for himself and for Maya. He gathered what evidence he had, holding back the most damning pieces in secret, waiting for the moment to strike. As the summit drew closer, both Maya and Ethan found themselves standing at the edge of ruin. She was branded a traitor, he was accused of losing control, and their enemies seemed poised to deliver the final blow. Yet in the quiet moments when the storm outside grew loudest, they found in each other the ember of hope that refused to die. "This isn't the end," Maya told him one night, her voice steady despite the weight pressing down on her. "They may think they've buried us, but ashes can burn again." Ethan studied her, and for the first time since their alliance began, he allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. And so the stage was set. The Global Investor Summit would not merely decide the future of Maddox Biotech. It would decide whether truth could rise from the ashes of lies, whether a billionaire and a waitress could stand together against the machinery of betrayal and emerge unbroken. Redemption and revelation. The Global Investor Summit loomed like a mountain peak shrouded in storm clouds. For weeks it had been the point toward which every move and countermove led, the battlefield where Ethan's empire and Maya's integrity would either be salvaged or crushed forever. Yet as the day drew closer, Maya found herself in a liminal space, half exiled, half defiant, carrying the weight of public disgrace. She was no longer permitted inside the headquarters of Maddox Biotech. Her access cards were revoked. Her name circulated in headlines that painted her as a cunning infiltrator. She had been cast out, marked as untrustworthy, and it would have been easier, safer, to retreat into obscurity and let the storm pass over her. But something deep within her refused. She had been underestimated before, silenced before, and every time she had clawed her way forward again. This time would be no different. Her apartment had become both sanctuary and prison. The curtains stayed drawn to keep out the cameras that occasionally lingered below, the reporters hungry for a glimpse of the fallen whistleblower. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken worry. Her mother's condition had worsened. Each coughing fit seemed to carve more life out of her fragile frame. And yet, even as she lay weak in her chair, she squeezed Maya's hand with the quiet strength of a woman who refused to see her daughter broken. "You were born to see the truth," her mother whispered one evening, her voice hoarse but resolute. "Don't let lies define you." Those words, as fragile as breath, anchored Maya when doubt gnawed at her. Meanwhile, Ethan moved with the precision of a man preparing for war. Publicly, he allowed the board and the press to believe that Maya's disgrace had shaken him, that his empire was wavering. Privately, however, he was gathering evidence with meticulous care, holding close the pieces that would turn the tide at the summit. He had seen enough of Maya's conviction, enough of her insight to know the frame-up was deliberate. But proving it would require more than anger. It would require patience, timing, and the willingness to let his enemies believe they had won until the moment he struck. Ethan Maddox had not built an empire without learning the art of deception. And now, for the first time, he would wield it not for acquisition but for justice. In the days before the summit, a quiet rhythm developed between them. Though they were forced to meet in secrecy, Ethan would arrive at Maya's apartment late in the evening, his driver instructed to park blocks away, his presence disguised beneath the anonymity of the city's night. He would bring files, data, fragments of communication intercepted from his own network. Together, seated at the small kitchen table her mother had once used for Sunday breakfasts, they would sift through the pieces, looking for the invisible thread that tied the sabotage together. Maya, though officially discredited, brought clarity to the chaos. She noticed patterns in the data flow, redundancies in the fabricated emails, and eventually she spotted what no one else had: a flaw in the forgery. The fabricated security footage that showed her entering the restricted lab was time-stamped with metadata that did not match the building's digital log. It was subtle, buried deep, but once uncovered it was undeniable. The evidence had been planted. The night she discovered it, Maya pushed back from the table, her eyes blazing with a fire Ethan had come to recognize. "They framed me," she said, her voice trembling not with fear but with fury. "And they were sloppy. This proves it. Ethan leaned forward, studying the data she had highlighted. A rare smile touched his lips, not of amusement, but of grim satisfaction. "Then we have them," he murmured. For the first time in weeks, she saw relief in his eyes, not just for himself, but for her. Still, they knew evidence alone would not be enough. The conspirators had power, influence, and friends in high places. To reveal the truth, Ethan would need to wield spectacle as much as substance. The summit, with its global audience and press coverage, would be the stage. He and Maya crafted a plan that would not merely expose the sabotage, but humiliate those who had orchestrated it, leaving no room for doubt. Ethan would present the company's vision, highlighting the corrected formulas and the breakthroughs they promised. Then, at the critical moment, he would reveal the planted evidence and the flaws Maya had uncovered. The names of the saboteurs would be spoken not in private, but in front of the world. The night before the summit, Maya found herself alone with her mother, sitting quietly in the dim glow of a bedside lamp. Fear pressed heavy on her chest. Fear not for herself, but for what her involvement might mean for the woman who had sacrificed everything to keep her afloat. "What if this makes things worse?" she asked softly, her hand brushing her mother's frail fingers. Her mother's eyes opened slowly, and though her voice was faint, her words carried the weight of conviction. "Worse than living in silence? Worse than letting them bury you under lies? Maya, you are already paying the price. Now make it mean something." The day of the summit dawned with an electric tension in the air. The grand hall where it was held gleamed with wealth and ambition. Investors, journalists, and innovators filled the seats, their conversations a hum of speculation. Ethan walked to the podium with his usual poise, but there was an edge to his demeanor, a contained storm waiting to break. Cameras flashed, pens scratched across notepads, and all eyes turned to him. He began with confidence, presenting the vision of Maddox Biotech, the breakthroughs in regenerative medicine, the promise of formulas that could change the course of human health. The audience listened enraptured, though beneath the surface many waited for cracks to appear, eager to witness the downfall of a titan. Then, when the moment was ripe, Ethan shifted. He displayed the sabotaged formula, outlined the deliberate flaws, and then, with measured gravity, unveiled the evidence of the frame-up. The screen behind him lit with side-by-side comparisons, the fabricated footage, the mismatched metadata, the emails that bore the unmistakable signs of manipulation. And then, with a steady hand, he named the perpetrators, Ulrich, the European delegate, and his allies on the board. Gasps rippled through the hall, followed by murmurs that swelled into uproar. The accused tried to protest, their voices drowned by the evidence flashing on the screen. Ethan stood unmoved, his gaze cold as steel. And then, in a moment that shocked even the most jaded in the room, he turned from the podium and gestured toward the audience. Maya rose slowly from her seat, her presence commanding despite the weight of weeks of humiliation. She walked to the stage, her shoulders straight, her head high, and for the first time she stood not as a server or a scapegoat, but as a voice of truth. The room quieted as Ethan spoke again. "This is Maya Williams. She was framed because she saw what others refused to see. Without her, this company would have signed its death warrant. Without her, the truth would have been buried." His words carried not just defense but respect, and the audience knew it. The narrative shifted in that instant. The waitress they had mocked in headlines was no longer a traitor but a whistleblower, a savior of a billion-dollar empire. In the hours that followed, the fallout was swift. The saboteurs were escorted out under the eyes of the press, their reputations collapsing as rapidly as they had tried to orchestrate Ethan's downfall. Investors rallied behind Maddox Biotech, their confidence restored by the boldness of the revelation. And as for Maya, though her name had been dragged through mud, it was now spoken with awe, a symbol of courage, of truth rising against power. That night, when the cameras had dimmed and the hall had emptied, Ethan and Maya stood together in the quiet of his office. The storm was not entirely over. Enemies still lingered in the shadows, challenges still lay ahead. But they had survived the fire, and in doing so, they had forged something stronger than alliance. Ethan turned to her, his voice low but steady. "You were right. They underestimated you, and now they'll never forget your name." Maya looked out at the city lights, her reflection in the glass mingling with the skyline. She thought of her mother, of the countless nights she had doubted herself, of the long path from obscurity to this moment. And for the first time in years, she felt not like a shadow, but like a force of her own. The legacy of a whisper, the storm had broken, and for the first time in months, sunlight seemed to pierce through the weight that had hung over both Maya and Ethan. The Global Investor Summit had not only cleared Maya's name, but had also reshaped the narrative of Ethan Maddox's empire. What had once been a company teetering on the edge of collapse was now hailed as resilient, courageous, and forward-looking. The revelation of sabotage had stunned the industry, sending shockwaves through boardrooms across continents, and the names of the conspirators were spoken in tones of caution and derision. For Ethan, the summit had been more than a victory of business. It had been the reclamation of his integrity. For Maya, it was the vindication of her voice and the quiet, trembling whisper that had grown into a roar no one could ignore. In the weeks that followed, life began to shift, not all at once, but like the turning of a tide. Reporters who once camped outside Maya's apartment, hoping to capture the image of a disgraced woman, now requested interviews with the young whistleblower who had defied billionaires. She turned them away at first, wary of the spotlight, preferring to care for her mother and regain her own footing. But the story spread regardless, retold not just in business circles but among ordinary people who saw in her courage something they longed for in themselves. The power to speak when silence seemed safer. The strength to resist when the world demanded submission. She became, without seeking it, a symbol. Ethan, too, had changed. The arrogance that had once clung to him, the untouchable aura of a man who believed himself beyond reproach, had softened into something more grounded. He still commanded boardrooms, still spoke with authority that turned heads and silenced opposition, but there was a new weight in his voice, the humility of a man who had nearly lost everything, and the awareness that his empire had been saved not by wealth or power, but by the courage of someone he had almost dismissed. He carried that lesson with him like a scar, and it reshaped the way he led. His circle grew smaller, tighter, built not only on competence but on loyalty proven through fire. And at the center of it, he carved out a place for Maya. She had expected to return to anonymity once her name was cleared, to slip back into the quiet routines of waitressing and caregiving. But Ethan would not allow it. "You are not invisible anymore," he told her one evening, his voice calm but unyielding. "And you never should have been. You have a mind that sees what others miss, and this company needs that. I need that. So the question is not whether you belong here. The question is whether you are ready to embrace it." The decision was not simple. Maya still bore the weight of her mother's fragile health, the exhaustion of years of sacrifice, and the uncertainty of stepping back into a world she had once abandoned. Yet the fire inside her had been reignited, and she could not deny it. She accepted Ethan's offer, not as a token of gratitude but as a rightful place at the table she had once only dreamed of. She was no longer just the waitress who had whispered. She was a strategist, a voice of truth in a company rebuilding itself from the ashes. Her first act was not in the boardroom but in the lab. Standing once more among microscopes and formulas, she felt the old joy surge through her veins, the thrill of discovery, the music of numbers aligning into solutions that could change lives. With Ethan's support, she launched a new division dedicated to regenerative research, staffed not only with seasoned scientists but also with students and dreamers who, like her, had once been underestimated. "Genius can come from anywhere," she told the team at their first meeting, her voice carrying both conviction and memory. "Sometimes the quietest voices hold the loudest truths." The results were staggering. Within a year, her division unveiled breakthroughs that pushed the boundaries of medicine, discoveries that promised not just profits, but healing for thousands of patients. The world took notice, and so did the media, but Maya's focus remained steady. This was never about fame or recognition. It was about purpose, about proving that truth and resilience could carve light even through the darkest corridors of power. At home, her mother lived to see her daughter rise. Medical debts that had once hung over them like a shadow were paid in full, and care that had been rationed by necessity was now provided without hesitation. Maya often sat by her mother's side in the evenings, sharing stories of the lab, of the students she mentored, of the lives their research was already beginning to touch. Her mother's eyes would shine with pride. The weight of years of sacrifice finally transformed into joy. Ethan, for his part, found in Maya not just an advisor but a mirror, someone who reminded him of the fragility beneath power, the humanity often buried beneath ambition. Their relationship was not one of savior and saved, nor of billionaire and subordinate. It became a partnership forged in fire, bound by respect and tempered by truth. He would often recall the moment in the conference room when her whisper had stopped his hand from signing away his future. That moment, he knew, had not only saved his company, it had saved him. And so the legacy of a whisper grew. It became a story told in classrooms about courage. It became a parable whispered in office corridors about the danger of underestimating those who serve quietly. It became a reminder that the smallest act of defiance, born from conviction, can ripple outward to change lives, empires, and futures. For Maya, the legacy was personal. She no longer feared the shadows because she had stepped into the light and proven that she belonged there. She no longer doubted her worth because she had seen it recognized not only by Ethan, but by the world. And she no longer saw herself as the girl forced to abandon her dreams. She was a woman who had reclaimed them, reshaped them, and built something greater from the ashes of adversity. For Ethan, the legacy was humbling. His empire, once nearly undone by betrayal, now stood stronger, not because of wealth or strategy, but because he had learned to listen to the voice he had almost ignored. He carried that lesson into every deal, every negotiation, reminding himself that truth is often found not in the loudest voices, but in the quiet conviction of those brave enough to speak when it matters most. And for the world, the story became something larger than either of them. It was a reminder that no one is too small to matter, that no voice is too quiet to change the course of events. A whisper, when born of truth, can echo louder than the roar of money or the clamor of power. Years later, when Maya stood before a graduating class of young scientists, she told them the story not of her triumph but of her choice. "I was a waitress in a room full of billionaires," she said, her voice steady, carrying the weight of memory. "And I chose to speak when silence was easier. That choice changed everything. Not because I was extraordinary, but because I was willing to trust what I knew was true. Never let anyone tell you your voice does not matter. Sometimes it only takes a whisper to change the world." And with that, the legacy of her whisper was sealed, not as a single act of defiance, but as a testament to the enduring power of courage, truth, and the refusal to remain unseen.